es la red internacional de comunicación de la ciencia. Y yo no quisiera, como ya empezamos un poquito tarde, y creo que es muy importante que tengan la oportunidad de platicar con él, pues sin más, él viene de Irlanda, inicialmente es periodista, pero después se fue moviendo hacia el campo de la comunicación de la ciencia, y bueno, pues tiene una experiencia muy, muy amplia y muy diversa en lo que es el campo de la comunicación de la ciencia. Y bueno, pues hoy nos va a hablar, como pueden ver, sobre la investigación en el campo de la comunicación de la ciencia. Muchas gracias, Brian.
Gracias. Yo lo siento que no puedo hablar bien en español, pero I would like you to stop me at any time to seek clarification, to disagree, to in Spanish or in English. And if you speak bastante lento, entiendo, okay? So I had hoped we might have a conversation here, and I do, in that sense, therefore I ask you to interrupt me. I'm guessing, but please tell me, that most of you work in the practice of science communication, doing it, rather than writing about it or studying it. And Rosalba has a little finger up to say, no, I do the studies. Are there any others who do the studies? Yeah? Okay. Well, maybe the way we might get into this is to ask the question, what do those who work in the practice of science communication expect from, or hope from, or even care about the research in science communication? Is it of any consequence to you? And don't be polite. If you think no, well, it'd be really interesting to hear why no. But I'm going to, anyway, there's a rhetorical question for the moment. But if you have some answers, please, let's hear them, let's have that conversation. But let me say that in the PCST network, we are fortunate, but it was designed in this way, developed a community researcher here. Now I can sing a song. Will I take this one off, the other one? Are we okay? Sure. Leave both of them? No. Okay, okay. We're not in stereo. Okay. I've lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, sure. Actually, before we go on, is there some water available? I wonder if I could just, because I know I will begin to deshidratar or something like that. Yeah. Thank you very much. So maybe just to go from the rhetorical question to explore it a bit further, what is it reasonable for practitioners to expect from researchers? And what is unreasonable of course. Every question can be posed in another manner. Sure. Yeah, and to that question, without embarrassing anybody, yeah, how many of those of you who work in practice read on a reasonably frequent basis, read research? Some. And maybe that's not unrepresentative. Or to put it not as a double negative, positive, that is quite representative, I think, of the international community. Now, many people have made this into a big problem. Gracias. They've made it into a big problem of disconnection between practice and research. And they make it into a big problem because they believe that it is a function of research to serve practice. I take a different view. I would not expect that all research could translate into advice to practice or guidance to practice. Some of it will, and much of it will not. And I don't think that we have a particular problem in our field that is distinct and different from the situation in other fields. So in the field of journalism where I worked, there is a practice also of journalism studies. And journalists, the practitioners, by and large, in the vast majority, do not read the material from journalism studies and care even less. We do what we do, we know how we do it, we know what works, why would we read the research? So in a sense, because we now, in our community, or communities, we talk about this relationship, and we do actually collaborate and integrate, at least through PCST, the different communities. To some extent, we have less of a problem than in most other fields where the similar situation arises. Politicians and political scientists, journalists and scholars of journalism. And you can go on. You can think of other fields where this is, where these two aspects exist. But I want to emphasize that just as the communities of practice have evolved and diversified and expanded over the last 30 years, so also there is a 30-year, actually longer history of science communication research, which has developed in parallel with, in part, and in conjunction with, in part, and in confrontation with, in part, the practice. And that seems to me to be perfectly normal. And it seems to me perfectly unreasonable to expect that all research, or the majority of research, should be capable of translation into guidance to practice. And it should not be, research should not just be judged by its relevance to practice, at least not in terms of its immediate relevance. Are you understanding me okay? Yeah, because please do stop me. Okay, so that's my, if you like, my opening proposition. And it may be contentious, let's hear it in a minute, but I have a reason for making this as an opening statement in view of what I want to say in a minute. But I said, we have a history of science communication research. And these are some of the people who have made significant contributions. And it's not it's not an unbiased selection. All of these people are represented in an anthology which I edited along with Massimiliano Bucchi from Italy, which is a 4-volume set of what we consider to be the best in science communication research and reflection, writing about science communication, limited by having to produce it in English. Okay, so before you even ask, I can tell you this is a limitation, a restriction of this collection. Does anybody, do you recognize any of the names? I mean, some of them are friends of ours, but do you recognize any of the names? But who do you see? Bruce, yeah. Bruce Lewinstein, bottom right from the United States, who has also written, as I have, about the history of science communication research. But maybe just I'll pick a couple of figures, just to give you an idea about the autonomy, if you like, of this strand in science communication. So Brian Wynne, at the top left, is an English sociologist who is credited with, maybe incorrectly, but nonetheless, he is credited with the initial identification of the model of communication, of science communication, that was being used in the 1980s as the deficit model. Now, many of you have heard of the deficit model? Exactly. It is now part of our common language, the deficit model. Yeah. And Wynne is one of the people, or the person most often referred to as having developed this critique in the first instance. Okay? So the papers of his that get referred to are from 1991, 1992. And he's also very influential in the development of the ideas of lay expertise, yeah, lay knowledge, laico, okay? So there is expert knowledge, and there's different kinds of expertise, and so on. So he's made significant contributions in this field as a researcher, and clearly with an influence on practice. But that was not necessarily his intention in developing the critique of the deficit model or in developing the concepts of lay knowledge or lay expertise. Because he's a sociologist and he contributes to the production of new knowledge in the field of sociology. Yeah. So sometimes the impacts are direct, sometimes they're intended, and sometimes the impacts are indirect and not necessarily intended. Yeah. The person at the top in the center, I guarantee nobody here will recognize, okay? And yet, if I tell you that she originated the term visible scientists, you might say, yes, I think I know what that might mean, visible scientists, but she was the first person to develop the concept, and by visible scientists, she was referring in the 1970s to people like Carl Sagan, Margaret Mead, and others in the United States who were researchers who became highly visible through their involvement in mass media, principally television, the new mass medium of the age, and by other means as well. And one reason why you won't recognize her is because she withdrew from the field of science communication shortly afterwards. And yet her book, Visible Scientist, is frequently referred to still today, 40 years after its original publication as a PhD. Oh yes, that's a good question. Yeah. Ray, R-A-E, unusual name, Goodall, G-O-O-D-E-L-L. And actually, if you look her up now, she doesn't exist because she goes under a different name, Ray Simpson, and she works in a completely different field. But she is a significant figure in the history of science communication research for one publication which is still referred to. And I'll just give you another example of that in one other person here, and that's Dorothy Nelkin. Now, Nelken published a book, this is her here. She died less than 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And Dorothy Nelken wrote a book in the 1980s called Selling Science, How the Press Covers Science. And she had, that was 1987, and then she had a second edition in 1995. And that is one of the single most cited books in the field of any that I'm able to find. And the very concept that what the press was doing was selling science is a really important concept even today. Yeah. Now, I cannot say for sure, or cannot show for sure, any specific impact on the practice of science reporting, but it certainly has an influence on how we think about science reporting as either promotional or expositional, descriptive, or critical. And she was the first person to, well, not the only person by any means, but she was early in saying the press celebrates science in its coverage. And actually, if you look at the situation today, I think you might come to the same conclusion. That by and large, the press coverage of science is promotional, is celebratory, is congratulatory, and in a particular version that this has, that we have in the present, this is associated with wow, awesome, fascinating, exciting, cool, and again, wow again. And actually, wow was the term that a man called Fred Jerome used, writing in the same spirit about the science press of the 1980s, the science journalists of the 1980s, when he talked about the wow of science reporting. So these are people who have contributed to the field and to our understanding of the field, and maybe even without us knowing who they are or when they lived or what precisely they wrote about. They've contributed to the discourse, including the discourse of practice. Yeah? I mean, as practitioners, you have to think, am I overselling what I'm talking about? Yeah? Yeah. Is there, in radio and television, is there too much wow going on? Yeah? When do I need to stand back and think about this in a more dispassionate, more critical way? That's a practice question, it's a professional question, and it's also a research question. Yeah. Rosalba works on surveys, so she will recognize what? Exactly. She'll recognize Hans-Peter, and you'll recognize Martin Bauer, maybe. Martin Bauer here in the middle has done science attitude surveys all over the world, or has coordinated and collaborated on them and so on. Anyway, what I hope you've got from this is that we have a community of science communication researchers whose focus is on the practice to some extent, and not just on those who originate science communication, but also those who participate as publics. Yeah. So that's what the surveys are about. We have a community, and we have a tradition, and we have a history of this kind of endeavor. The next thing I just wanted to show you, because I'm interested in the notion that many of these people, sorry, just go back. Very few, if any of these people, wrote a book about science communication. Why? It's quite interesting to me that that's the case. So Brian Wynne, we know through many, many papers. Dorothy Nelken wrote a book, and it's a book that's remained very influential. This is a, no, okay. That's Jean-Marc Lévy-Leblanc, who's a French essayist on science. That's below him is Edna Einsiedel, who writes many chapters and papers about participation in science, and so on. And Bruce has written numerous chapters and reports and papers, but not a summary of either science communication as a whole or any particular aspect of science communication. And so we have, and I think it's a sign of maturity in the field. You know, that it's taken 30 years perhaps to get there, but we have a book. And it was published in 2016, and I recommend it to your attention. And the two authors are Maya Horst, who's a Danish sociologist of science, and Sarah Davies, who is based in her university, in Maya's university in Copenhagen, but is English by background, and who comes out of the field of science communication. And their study, as you can see, has a specific orientation to the idea of science communication in culture or science communication as culture. And there's a quote here, which may be too long to try and take it all in, but I hope you get the spirit of it. It's looking at science communication as part of society with aspects and impacts in democracy and culture and so on. Okay? Now this is very, very, very different from what was intended even when the DGDC was set up, you know, which isn't, it's in my lifetime, maybe not your lifetime, but my lifetime, yeah? You know, the idea that inspired and motivated people to do science communication 30 years ago was popularization. It was about getting science from the labs and from the journals out into the public. Yeah? And it was a transmission idea, a diffusion idea, a dissemination idea, a divulgación, and so on. All, you know the idea that I'm referring to. And now we are 30 years later looking at science communication in a much bigger context than merely the transmission or translation of science to the public, okay? Now, not everybody accepts this kind of approach. Not everybody is capable of implementing this kind of approach, but nonetheless, it has significant influence, and certainly in my view, it deserves to have more influence. However, there are other perspectives being offered, and I wonder how many people have heard of the idea of the science of science communication? No? Yes? Okay, so la ciencia de la comunicación científica, okay? Okay, well, I'm a little bit surprised, guys, because I thought that it's an evangelical movement in a way, and I thought that maybe Mexico might have been evangelized to some extent, okay? But you'll see the evangelical aspect of it in a second. I see that one of the growth industries in Mexico is churches, so yeah, I've seen two of these churches of the Luz del Mundo, quite extravagant. Anyway, the science of science communication has a short history as part of the field since 2012, and you can see quite easily where it claims to find the basis of this new science in psychology, in health communication, sociology, and so on, okay? And this has now developed further, but here's a short paper which is available open access that you can find in JCOM, which now has a America Latina edition, I'm glad to see, but JCOM is open access publication and published a paper by this man, Dan Cahan, or Cahan, I don't know, where he says that science communication, the science of science communication is something we just need to do. Let's do it. And the definition, we don't need to. Let's just do it. And he assumes that we understand something called the science communication paradox. And the paradox is that there is lots of scientific information here, and there's a huge public here that doesn't receive this science information, or doesn't accept it, or doesn't appropriate it, to use the term of Latin America. That's the paradox, is it? There's masses of information that's not absorbed in the society as a whole. Lots of it is irrelevant, and just as well it isn't absorbed, and lots of it is relevant, and it isn't absorbed. So is this a science problem only? No, clearly not, okay? But this is how the science of science communication has proceeded, which is to say we have a major problem of the non-acceptance of scientific information in the public. Now, do you recognize that? Historically, what does that look like or sound like? The deficit model. Doesn't it? Do you agree? The idea of the deficit model was that communication took place on the basis that we have something that they don't have and that they need to have. And this is a kind of new version of the deficit model, although not everybody who subscribes or is an aficionado to the science of science communication necessarily uses it in this way. Here's now they have the movement, if you like, has gone to this stage of producing a large book, a collection of essays by many different people. And the singular emphasis, or the shared emphasis, is again on the reception of information in the public. So they're looking at bias and the means by which people outside of the scientific community do or do not accept, understand, appreciate, appropriate scientific information. And the tools used are the tools of social psychology. And so they use concepts like cognitive dissonance, that people can hold to contradictory perspectives, that they can take the products of science and technology on the one hand and be superstitious and so on the other hand. And I'm standing in the middle of Mexico City yesterday, and people are queuing up to have their aura cleaned. And that's really interesting, in 2018. And in a way, it was not difficult. I actually found myself quite affected by it. The fact that people had that sort of reverence, in a sense, and at the other part of me was saying, this is a sham. This is a fraud, So, that's cognitive dissonance internally in a single individual. And do you know what? If we didn't have cognitive dissonance, it would be a very boring world. We all have contested ideas in our own heads, and we would expect communities to have contested ideas as well. So, in a sense, you might wonder, what's the problem with cognitive dissonance? But that's one of the issues that defines this particular way of approaching things. And there is now beginning to be an explicit questioning of the science of science communication. And I'm telling you this even though this may not be yet a settled idea, because I guess I want to get in my retaliation first. In a sense, just be careful, be cautious. There are people who have got this idea, it sounds very attractive to research funders. It sounds very attractive to those who want to believe that they can make science communication more effective, and that there are ways to do this, and that there are research ways to show how it can be done. And this relates to what I started by saying about research being more than just service to practice. Yeah. It's very attractive, and it's easy to understand why it may have some political and financial success. Yeah. And in the end, I think people will be disappointed. Do you know, if we knew how to communicate effectively at any level of certainty, you know, we would be out of business already. We would have sold the formula for millions somewhere. I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. I would have sold the formula, and I would have banked it, and I'd be touring the world. You know what I mean? Like, the truth of the matter is that we do not know how people respond to and receive the communications that we're setting up. And at some level, we cannot know. You cannot research how people respond to a television program independently of all of the other things that are influencing them. Yeah? And when you put people, as they do for these studies, you put undergraduate students into a room and you ask them to watch a documentary, and then you ask them, you know, what do they remember of it and so on. You've created an entirely artificial situation which does not correspond to the experience of members of a family arguing on the sofa about which television program to watch, and then, you know, disagreeing about, you know, arguing about the food that they're having while the television program is on, and all the other things that are interrupting and affecting how they do or don't see, do or don't listen, etc., and so on, so on. Now, I'm sure many of you do visitor studies in museums, yeah, and this is a very well-developed field, yeah. But what does that tell us about the experience of people going to a museum? You know, closed surveys can only tell us so much. And the more elaborate, expensive way of doing the research through open-ended questions, interviews, observations over many years, and so on, well, it's just very expensive. It's very expensive in time and other resources, and uncertain in its results. There's another version of the science of science communication which may come to you as well, which is the idea of evidence-based science communication. It has the same problems as far as I'm concerned. What's the evidence? What kind of evidence? Where does the evidence come from? And you know, do you really, can we be certain at any reasonable level that we know how communication works on those who are the supposed recipients or whatever? How much time do we have? Yeah, sure. Okay. No, I just I'll hurry this along. What I just said may be something for further reflection and discussion. I'm just going to present to you a kind of a sketch of how we might consider a research in science communication as it has evolved and as it is, science communication research as it has evolved and as it is at present. And this is part of some work that is not yet published, so by all means, I'm not saying no fotografias, no, it's okay. It's okay, but just be aware that by the time it's published, it may look a bit different. Okay, that's all right. And this is trying to present, in the first instance, a fairly simple and necessarily reductionist account of the field of practices on which research then is done, okay? And it may be helpful to think of the field of practice or the fields of practice as being researched under the heading, or even for doing strategy, as research under the headings of contexts or actors, publics, or representations. And for any particular project, you might be focusing on one more than the other, but not necessarily one exclusively, and the others not at all. And so if your focus is on the publics, you'll be using influences from social psychology. If your focus is on representations, in other words, how do we tell the stories of science, you may be deriving something from literature. If your focus is on the context, and so on, okay? And these disciplines all have something to contribute. And these are not as limited as the disciplines that are referred to in the science of science communication. This is much broader, okay? So CAPR or CRAP. Actually, I don't recommend using CRAP. Okay. You understand, okay? But it's hard to, once you've seen it, it's hard not to remember it. You can't unremember it once you've seen it. But actually, maybe that's a good point, actually. Now, okay, I'm going to defend the idea of CRAP, okay? As a way of thinking about, what are the aspects of science communication, how we might think of the whole. And if we then, so that the first one is talking about the disciplines that we might draw on. This is looking at the field of practice, if you like, in its raw, early state, where the representations were defined by popularization, where the publics were defined in terms of scientific literacy, and so on. Yeah? And now we have a much more complex picture where each of the dimensions has elaborated, diversified, complicated, and so on. So, and I'm sure part of this is a familiar territory, and maybe some of it is still, as it were, to be discovered and to be documented and to be researched. So, for example, where we look at actors, we've mentioned here critics and activists, for example, as actors. Yeah? So that would include, for example, opponents of genetically modified organisms, just as an example, yeah? Who are engaged in a form of science communication, which is often referred to as anti-science. In my view, quite wrongly. I'm not a supporter. I'm not saying that's not the point. I actually think it's really hard to find anybody who is anti-science. There are people who disagree with aspects of science. It's very hard to find somebody who stands up and says, I disagree with science. That's basically like saying, I disagree with civilization, or I disagree with humanity. Yeah, you've basically, this is one of the highest achievements of humanity and of civilization and of culture. You can't really support a statement that says, I reject it. Yeah? Oh, maybe you can. And you live as a hermit somewhere in Bajo, California or something, I don't know. Anyway, over here under publics, by which the difference here is actors and publics is actors, the focus on actors is looking on the people who are engaged actively in the process. The publics are those who are either the context or the recipients or whatever of what's being done. And here, the term is referred to, I don't dare use this, but I'll try. Here. The terms referred to are uses and pleasures. Now, we don't often talk about the pleasure of science communication. But this is a known concept in cultural studies, in audience studies, and I think it has something useful also for us in science communication. That the experience of going to a science center has traditionally been seen as one of learning. Yeah, albeit it's not learning like in school, but it's still, in some sense, learning. It may be learning to appreciate, learning to understand, learning to be curious, etc., etc. But it may also be, like going to an art gallery, a pleasure. We don't expect art galleries, which we give many millions in public funds to, we don't expect them to turn people towards scientific careers or towards scientific understanding, or towards artistic careers or artistic understanding. We have different expectations in the field of science, interestingly. But the experience of an art gallery may be thought of in terms of pleasure, and maybe the experience of going to a piece of science theatre, or going to a science comedy, or going to a science cafe, may be that of pleasure. You may not actually remember a single piece of information, but you may have enjoyed the process. And researching pleasures is really difficult, but it's really worthwhile. It may be really valuable. So this is a part of filling out the picture of science communication as part of culture, as explored by Horst and Davies in their book, is to think of participation in science communication activities as cultural experience, and as an experience, potentially at least, an experience of pleasure. That might be a very good place to stop, actually, because I think it's allowed me to, I hope, say something about the uses and pleasures of research as well. I enjoy doing research in this field. I don't know if I'm having any impact, and I don't dare even think about my influence, But it can be, if it's stimulating at an intellectual and emotional and in an effective way, it has its own value, Now, if I find my work as being cited, well, that's also an indication of impact, but it's also a pleasure. I think we're very lucky to be in this field. I think we're very fortunate to be in a field that is young, that is developing, that has significant resources. It's never enough, but some significant resources behind it, political, intellectual, financial, and others, organizational, that has a future path, that is opening out into new questions, and that is at the interface or the crossover points between the sciences and the humanities. And if I had to summarize what are the most interesting, any of the most interesting intellectual questions of the day, they are questions where the sciences and the humanities intersect. Not by coincidence, I think. And so we were even having a discussion just moments ago about the concept of light. And the concept of light as a museum subject, is an idea of physics, and it's an idea of biology, but it's a principle in art, it's a principle in architecture, and it's a notion that has to do with the history of ideas, the notion of the Enlightenment. And when we talk about people having a light bulb moment, do you know that thing, where a bulb actually lights up above your head? There's something about that goes well beyond the physics of light to light as a metaphor, which I think is really interesting. And those are, thinking about those sorts of combinations, those analogies, those crossovers, seem to me to be some of the most interesting questions that we get of contemporary culture. And so you're lucky, I'm lucky to be part of this. Thank you. Now, I don't know if I've enlightened you at all, but if it's all still darkness, please ask a question.
Susanna. I work here. I do history of science communication. And I think your talk is very stimulating in many ways.
What?
I have I have too many questions, but I'll make one and then I'll let the people get in. It's a bit strange for me that I know nothing about the science of science communication.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm perceiving you correctly. You're saying that it's a bit not desirable, or I don't know exactly how. You don't seem very happy with it. And yet you say this is a young field and it's expanding. Isn't it healthy to have diversity? And in that sense, isn't it great that there's people doing odd things so we can discuss?
Absolutely. And I may not have been as careful as I should be. I was speaking at the Sommelicite conference about the concept of a field. And I talked about a field in many ways. And one of the ways in which a field of activity is constituted, according to the notions that the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu developed, is that there is a contest of ideas. And yes, I think we're at an interesting conjuncture. I know you like the word conjuncture. I think we're at an interesting conjuncture, and the very fact that we have, as it were, two clearly different trends emerging, one being the science of science communication, the other being the kind of cultural approach of Davies and Horst and many others, is a sign of our maturity, a sign of our becoming a field, and I'm indicating a preference. But it's not in order to say, no, they should be excluded. What I'm concerned about is that there is a claim that a particular approach represents the science of science communication. And so, in a sense, it's a kind of an imperialist idea, and I'm a born anti-imperialist. Like, the claim is too big. And the claim is highly reductionist, that the science of science communication is to be found only in using these kinds of quantitative methods.
But they're making it open so we can discuss.
Absolutely.